My name is Deborah Humphreys. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Public Engagement at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And just so you can make sure you're, as someone joked yesterday, this is the session Degrees, Credentials, Competencies, Transcripts. So if you're want to be on a different flight, going to a different city, you should be in a different room. But if that's where you want to go, this is that session. And I was actually assigned to moderate this session after it had already been sort of created and the title had been created. And I joked with my my colleagues, and I said, well, don't you think we could get maybe another really meaty word in that title? It may be the longest one, I don't know. Degrees, Credentials, Competencies, Transcripts, documenting what students know and can do with their learning. But the good news is that we have some terrific and very wise guides to help us through the thicket of all of the issues embedded in those words: degrees, credentials, competencies, transcripts. So what we're going to do this morning is no technology whatsoever other than microphones. I will introduce each of them, and we're going to basically have a conversation with each other and with all of you on the many intersecting issues at stake here in addressing the question, what do degrees mean? What are the competencies that need to be demonstrated to actually achieve the degrees? What does a credential mean? And how do we help students and ourselves understand what students know and can do with their learning? And let's see if we're in order here. We have with us Amy Leitonen, who is with the New America Foundation. And when we get started, I'm going to ask each of them to say perhaps a word or two more about their pathway to this particular topic. So Amy can say a little bit about her background. But right now, she is with the New America Foundation. Dwayne Matthews is Vice President for Policy and Strategy at Lumina Foundation. And I'm sure you've already seen on your seats the new fresh edition of the Degree Qualifications Profile, which we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about, and which Dwayne and his colleagues have worked very hard on. And then all the way on the end is Elena Silver, who is the Senior Associate for Public Policy Engagement from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Little preview, they have a very important report that is coming out next week, is that right? Next week, on the credit, what is it called? Are you
allowed to tell us?
The Carnegie unit is, sort of.
It's about the Carnegie unit, and I think if we're really good, maybe we'll get her to divulge just a bit or two about what's going to be in that report. But we're all waiting with bated breath for what Carnegie has to say about that. So I think I'm actually going to sit down so that we can have more of a conversation than a formal presentation. And we'll make sure that you can hear us. So far, the mics have been pretty good. But if in the back you can't hear us at any point, just raise your hand. And we will definitely have some time for questions. The way we thought we would begin is I want to say a little bit about sort of the moment we're in and reflect a little bit on that to set a context. One of the things that I do at AAC&U is try to pay attention to not just what's happening within higher education and the ways in which we can advance the changes we know we need to make, but how those outside of higher education are looking at these same issues. And so I've for many years pored over lots and lots of public opinion data. And the troubling thing, unfortunately, is that public skepticism about our enterprise has been going up and up. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. And I have felt for a long time that one key thing we all have to pay a lot more attention to in that kind of environment is getting a whole lot clearer about what college degrees really mean. Not just rhetorically making the case that we're so great, or even that liberal education is so great, but getting right in the weeds and really being much more clear so that people understand what a degree really means and what it needs to mean. And it seems to me that that's a threshold issue that if we don't address, we can't answer all the other questions about, is it worth the money? Is it worth more debt? Are we worth the public investment of tax dollars or tuition dollars? So clarity about what the college degree means. And I think that one of our big challenges is we have to do that in light of a very rapidly changing environment. So we may have a sense of what we think a college degree really means, but unfortunately we're in an environment where what students need keeps changing, and actually the bar keeps being raised for what they need. So in addition to clarifying what a degree really needs to be in the 21st century, I think we also have to somehow, and I don't have the full answer to this, crack this problem of helping people see the scope of what we're trying to do, and to be a bit more realistic. Many of you know that we've done a lot of employer surveys, and so I often get questions about what employers want. And one of the things I always try to say, usually too late in the interview to actually get in the article, unfortunately, is, there's a limit to how much young people can be moved along a pathway in 4, 5, or 6 years. So while it's absolutely essential that we recognize the bar has been raised, we also have to put a little dose of reality into what is possible for a young person to do in 4 to 6 years. But the reality is we do have this declining public confidence about the value in college degrees. And in many ways, the fact that employers and the general public aren't confident, one of the things is they're not confident that just because a student graduates with a certain number of credits, that they actually have demonstrated the proficiencies that a college-educated person needs in the 21st century. The other big shift, of course, is in the demand for college-educated workers. The economic data is pretty clear on this, despite what you often read in the media, that we absolutely have to not only increase our graduation rates for traditional age students, but if we're going to meet the demands of the new economy, there's a whole bunch of students who are out in our society, many of whom have some credits and no degree, who need to come back, and we need to really figure out how our structures are serving them or not serving them and how we can serve them better. And I will mention just 1 or 2 data points from our employer survey about the question of transcripts, for instance. Only about 9% of the employers that we surveyed just a month or 2 ago said that the college transcript is very useful in evaluating college students' potential as a job candidate. So 91% not thinking it's so useful. Many of you know that AAC&U has been working for a while with our members who are interested in developing e-portfolios, both as a vehicle for learning and development, but also potentially as a vehicle to provide students a better path to demonstrating what they know. So we've been asking this question for a couple of surveys. About 80% say that an e-portfolio would be either very useful, 36% said very useful, or fairly useful, 44%. And those numbers are up in the last couple of years. So that's sort of the big picture. Each of the people on this panel comes at different aspects of this, but I think we'd like to start with you, Dwayne. Lumina has obviously taken the lead in sort of addressing this very first imperative that I just talked about, greater clarity about what the degree means through the DQP. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what the goals were originally of the foundation in launching the DQP initiative, and whether you are thinking about it differently in this new environment.
Oh, thanks. Great questions. Great to be with all of you, and to see so many people that have really been involved in this work in so many different ways, and I hope to do justice to the work that all of you have done on this. I'm occasionally asked, fairly often asked, what brought Lumina into this question about the quality of degrees? Why did we get into this area? As you all know, this is not something for the timid to get involved in. It is a slippery slope. We took our first step on that slope about 6 years ago, and it's important to keep reminding ourselves that for Lumina at least, we remind ourselves, this is all about our goal. Everything Lumina does is about the goal, to get more Americans holding high-quality post-secondary credentials. I could talk at great length. I've got PowerPoints if any of you are interested in the case for doing that. I assume most of you are convinced of that, perhaps, hopefully all of you, about the need for that. The fact that that was the number one takeaway from the State of the Union address was something about expanding higher education opportunity is, I think, something we should pause and reflect on for a moment, that that's what the public captured out of that speech, was the single sort of breakout idea, was that more Americans should have the opportunity to get post-secondary education. That speaks to something very deep and something important. But the goal for us was, of course, this quantitative goal of 60% of Americans holding high-quality credentials. About 6 years ago, when Lumina was doing, in 2008, when Lumina was doing our first strategic plan, we've been talking about the goal for some time, but we wanted to involve the board in it, we wanted to make it an official statement, and we wanted to build our strategic plan around it. So I remember this very clearly. We went to a board meeting, a Lumina Foundation board. We have a very good board, and we talked to them about the goal, and reaction was very positive. They said, this is great, we love it. It's very clear, it's very focused. We like it. But 10 minutes into the conversation, one of our board members, Frank Alvarez, some of you may know, asked the question, but I just have one question. He said, what do you mean by high quality? Because we said high quality credentials. Now, let's pause for a moment. Why did we have that two-word phrase in the goal statement in the first place? Well, you know the answer. Because as soon as we started talking about increasing attainment in this country, people said, oh, well, the only way you can increase attainment is to lower quality. Everybody knows it's a zero-sum game. The amount of quality is fixed. You either give lots of it to a little number of people or you give a little of it to lots of people. And so if you're talking about increasing attainment, well, we know how to do that. We can just, print more diplomas. That's easy. So we, of course, were highly responsive to those concerns, and so we added two words, high quality, to the goal statement and figured that would solve the problem. Of course, they have to be high quality. So our board saw through that immediately and said, so how do you define high quality? So I was the one sitting there at the time, and so my answer, which was, I thought, both cunning and insightful, was, we'll get back to you on that. And I mean, think about it. Here we are. We're Lumina Foundation. We think we're hot shots. We think we know something about higher education. And I was clueless. I'd worked in higher education for a long time. I had a whole career like all of you. I had no idea how to even begin to answer that question, even conceptually. So we had 2 months, and we came up with a definition which went into the strategic plan, and I'll prove to you that this is the truth. It is a footnote to the strategic plan. It was added so late. It's the only footnote in the strategic plan. And it is the definition of high quality. It says high quality, asterisk, or 1. We call it footnote 1. You go down to the bottom of the page. It says, Lumina defines high quality credentials, degrees and credentials is what it said in that plan, as those with clear and transparent learning outcomes leading to further education and employment. That's what we came up with. And it's held up remarkably well. I want to talk a little bit about it, but the most important thing that did for us at the very beginning was something that I didn't even realize until a little bit later what had happened. And that was when we were asked the question, what does high quality mean in the context of attainment and the goal? The only way to answer the question was to talk about high quality credentials, high quality degrees. The quality was in the degree, not in the institution. The quality is in what the student takes away from the experience, not in what all of us have in terms of resources and inputs and everything else that feeds that educational process. Contrast that with with rankings, the rankings we're most familiar with, which measure all of the inputs, all of the things which are proxy measures of the quality of the institution. Ask most people what they think about a quality higher education. They think about quality institutions. They immediately start talking about what are the quality institutions. But from that moment, we stopped talking about quality in terms of institutions and began talking about quality in terms of degrees and student outcomes. That led to, all right, what are we going to do about this? How do we turn this definition into something real? It's an extraordinarily difficult nut to crack, again, as you all know. We started with tuning. You probably all know of tuning or heard of it. This is the process that was developed by faculty in Europe. It's a faculty-led process to have the disciplines talk about what the learning outcomes need to be of the degrees in a institution or set of institutions in a particular discipline. We found this was a conversation faculty were very willing to have, but as soon as you start talking about that, then you need some sort of structure or framework to make sense out of those conversations. That led to LEAP. LEAP led to the DQP. And the DQP is leading to an even broader framework to incorporate all forms of post-secondary learning, certificates, workforce relevant credentials, other kinds of certifications, all into a common framework so that the learning that it all represents can be made transparent and clear to everybody involved in the process. I'd say just one more thing. Who are the main beneficiaries of this? Employers obviously have an interest in this. The public has an interest in it. Policymakers have an interest in knowing what students are learning. Faculty certainly have an interest in this, the institutions themselves. But who has the primary interest in knowing what the degree represents? The student. It's all about the learner, and the learner owning their own learning. It's important that they learn. Everything we've learned about the goal ever since is that the goal is not about 60% as a magic number of pieces of paper. That's true. It's actually, people actually need to learn this stuff. There's a need behind this. The world we live in requires the knowledge and the skills. So people actually need to learn it, so it is about learning. But people also have to own their learning. They have to know what it is. They have to be able to understand it themselves so that they can use it themselves and apply it wherever they want to apply it, whether it's for employment, a job, or whether it's further education, which is why the definition was education and employment. So that's where we got. It was and we're far from the end of this particular pathway. I think we're going to be on it forever. It's an exciting road to be on, but for us, it all goes back to the goal.
Thanks so much, Dwayne. Some of you know when we launched LEAP about 10 years ago, one of the first things we did, first of all, we talked to our members, of course, and we had a whole series of forums around the country where we brought together educators, but also people outside of higher education to start to answer this question. What does it mean to be well educated in the 21st century? But we also did some focus groups with students, and we did them 10 years ago, and then we did some more this past fall. And it has been interesting to watch some progress and not other progress. At the beginning, it was very, very clear that students, the messages they had heard from our society were go to college, get prepared to go to college, but we're not really going to explain exactly how you do that, except to do well in your classes. That was pretty much it. And then when you asked, okay, well, what do you think is going to be expected of you in college? There was either silence or, well, they're gonna tell me. I mean, there was this wonderful moment in the original focus groups where we kept trying to get them to have a sense of, what they were trying to get out of it and how the learning related to that, and they had no vocabulary for it whatsoever. Right. But one of them said, well, I don't really know what's going to be required, but they're going to tell me, right? I mean, literally, that's what they said. And I said, yeah, I hope they do. I hope they do. But the good news is that actually in our most recent survey, we just, in addition to the focus groups, we just did a survey of students. And actually the report we released a couple of days ago has some of the data, but not all of the data because we had so much data. There's going to be a follow-up report that's just going to focus on what we heard from students. And I actually did see some progress. The students in that survey did have a better sense of the broad outcomes that really matter in today's world. Now, that's not to say that they have a very clear map on how to get to those outcomes or connections between what they're doing in college and that. But there was definite movement that I saw in that survey if you compare what we were hearing 10 years ago.
What were those outcomes?
The 5 outcomes that actually both employers and students said were very important for success beyond college. They're all things you can all rattle them off. We could probably, okay, so what do you think they are? Somebody shout them out. Okay, critical thinking, that's one. Communications, written communication, oral communication. No, quantitative literacy isn't on the top 5. ethical reasoning and decision making, and the fifth was the ability to take what you're learning and put it into action in the real world. So real world applied learning. And the only, I mean, you could all rattle off, and then there's, 15 others that we know are also important, but those are the ones that came out on the top of the list. And for me, the most significant thing was that it was the same 5 for the employers and for the students. The media completely missed this point. They were, all that mattered was that the students thought they were doing well and the employers thought they weren't doing well, and completely unremarkable finding, but so for me, that was very interesting.
Right.
Now, we're far from there, but so let me move to you, Elena. We're talking about learning, but of course there is this thing called the credit hour that is this proxy that we developed a while ago to help us track student progress, potentially student progress in learning. And you're obviously about to release a report on it. Given that it's our centennial, the staff we've been in this historical kind of frame of mind. So I wonder if you could start by saying a little bit about the credit hour itself and where it came from. Like, how did we end up with this thing that everybody's dissatisfied with, but somehow all our systems are attached to? And then if you're able to share a little bit about a forward-thinking look that's in the report that's coming out. So.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I actually think it's important to dial back for a minute and get some of the historical context, because 2 of the questions that have already been raised, one, how to expand access, like this is what we're doing now, we're trying to expand access to higher education to a growing and diverse population of students, and then also what does it mean to be educated in the 21st century? Okay, these questions, except this is the 20th instead of the 21st, were asked then. Dial back 100 years.
You mean we were not the first ones?
We were not. This is not the first time this conversation has been had, except we didn't have the DQP.
Yeah.
So if you can flash back with me 100 years, 10 years actually, it's 1905. What's important about the context of the nation at this point is we have a booming population, an immigrant population. Ellis Island at this point is 10 years old. New York City, like 3/4 of New York City, are first generation Americans or immigrants. We have very low attainment. Only like less than 8.8% are graduating from high school. We have a tremendous amount of innovation happening. So while that we have these 2 other things, we also have lots of innovation. This is a time, not just in education, this is a time when we have innovation in flight, right? We have the Wright brothers. This is a time when we're discovering whole new ways of living, and there's huge societal transformations happening. The printing press, all these things are happening, and it is changing the way we think about education. And what that means is that at that time, there's a huge opportunity and demand to make education, to improve the quality of education, and to improve access to higher education. At this time, we also have Andrew Carnegie, who most of you probably know was the leader of the industrial elite at that time, one of the richest men, I think he was at the time the richest man in this country. He, an immigrant himself, was about to retire. He had all this extra money. And he wanted to do something with it. His idea was that he wanted to provide pensions for teachers in higher education. That was his vision, and that's why he created the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. It was this pension system that he had in mind, which led to the Carnegie Unit and the credit hour. And I'll describe how in a minute. But it is important to also say that when he said teachers in higher education, we think faculty, right? And we know now that we think of a distinction between the teachers that might be in elementary and secondary and the faculty who are in higher education. By the way, I have to say, the high quality question, if you called the K-12 people who were dealing with high quality teacher at the time, the HQT, this was they would have been with you. So they've been in K-12 trying to define high quality teaching has been quite the explosive debate for the past 10 years at least. But in any event, we have this person who wants to give to the teachers of higher education, but it's not actually clear what higher education is at this time in the nation. So the distinction between high schools and colleges and universities, it's very difficult to see any of those differences. And so what happens is the trustees of this new foundation have to define what a college is. They have to distinguish what is a college versus what isn't a college so that you'll be eligible for this pension system. We can't just give it out to anyone. We have to give it out to real colleges. Well, what makes a real college a college, or what makes a college a real college? And so there were three things. One was you had to have at least 6 full-time professors, and these changed. There were a few more, but primarily there were 3. You needed to have at least 6 full-time professors. You needed to have a program in liberal arts and sciences of at least 4 years, and you needed to have, and this is where the Carnegie unit comes in, you needed to have admissions requirements, meaning that for you to be a real college, it meant that the only people you were allowing to enter, your entrance requirements, were students that had been through a rigorous 4 years of academic preparation. This is the high school then, right? That they've been through at least 4 years of academic preparation. And they define that in terms of units. And so it was, you need 14 units. Each unit is 120 hours. And then if anybody in this room's ever been in an American public high school, this will sound familiar, that you need to spend an hour, 5 days a week, for the whole academic year in order to get the credit for that subject. That was then divided into semesters. This, of course, was translated into a credit hour in higher education and became, as was referenced, ubiquitous and sort of pervasive throughout the system. I'm sure everyone knows and can name a dozen ways in which the credit hour affects your jobs or the work that you do. The important thing about the history is, in part, if you think about the time of the nation, what was happening, this massive expansion of the system, the idea of having a unit, a simple, quantifiable, logical unit to define, to measure the work of an institution, that was the idea. That was the point. It was not really ever to measure student learning. It was like, we have this massively expanding system. We want to improve quality. We want to improve access. We've got all these institutions popping up. We're trying to make sense of this. This is also a time when we have an efficiency movement happening. Let's standardize this. We got to figure out a way of doing this. This unit, simple, quantifiable unit, seems like a really good way to do that. And that's why it started, and that's why it's stuck. And stuck is probably, a good word in two ways. So, the Carnegie Foundation has a long history of studying higher education. And the Carnegie Commission on Higher Education in the 60s and 70s put out a ton of work about higher education, the future of higher education. I guess the future is now. Some of it seemed like it was predictive. They wrote about the various scholars that were commissioned for these pieces, wrote about whether we should shorten the length of a degree, whether we should have more flexible routes to credentialing, about how community college should be free, all sorts of things that were put out as ideas. They were thought pieces. Some of them had recommendations, some of them didn't. The point of this is that the foundation has always wanted to be engaged in these conversations and to promote the reform conversation. That's why we did this research. We spent more than a year, my colleague Taylor, who's right here, and I spent a lot of talking to everyone we possibly could, which was amazing to see the interest of people. Primarily, I will say, in higher education. We did look throughout, K-12 all the way through higher education. But when you ask the question about the credit hour, the Carnegie Unit, higher education, they respond. So there was a lot of a response from, there was a huge response from higher education, and we had a tremendous opportunity to talk to people, students, faculty, deans, and provosts, and institutional leaders and presidents, and registrars and admissions officers, and unions, everyone you can imagine, who wanted to talk to us and who we reached out to try to understand how the credit hour fits in today's system. And we have a report that tries to lay that out. It tells a lot of the history. It explains how the Carnegie Unit and the credit hour is pervasive in the system, K-12 all the way through higher education, what the implications are for that in today's reform landscape. And that was the purpose of the report, and that's what the report does. So I hope you'll all read it.
Stay tuned. Thank you, Elena. So we'll move on to Amy, and before I ask Amy a question, I do want to thank her because, and Dwayne, one thing that's wonderful about the AAC&U community and the generosity of the Academy is that I have actually been rather critical of some of the focus on completion and some of the policy fervor for better efficiency being the thing that's driving things. And there is obviously a serious critique of the idea that we are awarding degrees based on seat time alone. And I have tried in a few pieces that I've written to remind people that as bureaucratic as the credit hour is, it is something that reflects what educators, that it isn't an empty vessel for educators, that many educators still believe they are awarding credit for work that students are actually doing. There is a connection between those two things. It's not always perfect, but educators are trying to do that. And that while we certainly shouldn't be awarding credit just for sitting in a seat, that what we do know from research by some of the people sitting in this room is that learning actually does take time. And in fact, potentially more time than we are actually providing to students. So there is still a really important time element in learning. So I have sometimes been critical, and the thing that I want to say is that Amy is extremely generous, and even when I'm critical, she engages with me, and that's fantastic. And so I respect very much the work that she is doing and her willingness to keep in dialogue with lots of other people. And one of the things that Amy is known for writing about and thinking about is this shift we need to make, and I agree with this, but from the focus on time and the credit hour to a focus on competency or proficiency. And what I want to start with, Amy, is if you could say a little bit about, from the policy perspective, how you think about that transition, and particularly how you think about it relative to the thing that I mentioned earlier, basically the new majority student and the need for us to think really seriously about all those students out there who don't have a degree but do have some credits, and adult returning students whom we need to bring into the system.
Sure. So thank you. I feel exactly the same way, and I feel like we have to be engaging in conversation if we're going to make this not an either or, not a attack the academy or attack the workforce, or I mean, I think part of the problem is we all just get in our little our ideological corners and we sort of stay there. But I think AAC&U has done such incredible work to really dig into this, and my hope is that policymakers will engage with this work and continue to engage, and that helps inform the policy conversation. So I think the policy conversation, the reason there's so much interest in this right now is for the reasons you sort of teed up with, is that we're sort of at this critical point in higher education where it's never been more necessary and it's never been more expensive. So we have, so in addition to the quality and completion issues, what clearly is motivating a lot of the policy interest are the cost issues. And I think that, so we have more people who need to go to college. At the same time, more and more evidence that higher education isn't really doing what it says it's doing. I mean, the national, the assessment of adult literacy in this country found that college graduates, 69% of college graduates could not compare opposing editorials. These are college graduates. I mean, you have the employer surveys, you have students who are saying, yikes, I'm in all this debt and I can't find a job because I don't have the skills employers want, which were the things that everybody in the room earlier sort of said, and they're the things that higher education promises to deliver, right? Like the critical thinking, not just we're going to teach you this sort of bucket of knowledge so that you can be a robot and cite these facts and cite these dates, and but that you actually know how to solve unscripted problems, you know how to put new things together, because that's what the 21st century sort of demands. So so higher education is more necessary, and it's also now a riskier proposition because the costs are so much higher. More and more students are taking on debt, and there's a lot of taxpayer dollars at stake. I mean, the federal government, just in and of itself, in terms of federal financial aid, spends $150 billion a year in Pell Grants and loans, right? That doesn't include, all that states are doing, and it doesn't include VA benefits and GI benefits. So there's a lot of concern that, wait, higher education is really important. It says it's delivering this. We're paying for this, but we're not really sure what we're getting. And it's more important than ever, particularly for the students that higher education in this country hasn't historically served really well. So I was sort of struck by, I don't think this will come as a shock to anyone here, but the OECD last year issued a report. It basically, does these surveys of its, not surveys, studies, goes on site of its member countries, over 25 countries, looking at higher education, and it came away with sort of these three concerns about higher education in the US: its lack of quality, coherence, and transparency. And to me, that's one of the reasons that I'm interested in competency-based education, because I think really at its best, and the sort of promise of it, is that it can get at all three of those things. And it's sort of this radical idea that, higher education should be about learning and not about time. So in any case, that's the backdrop of the urgency around the federal policy conversation. And policymakers are really interested. I mean, this is sort of, to an extent that somebody, even like me, who's excited and pushing about this, I start to get nervous. But everybody's excited about it. It's competency-based education, competency-based, and folks are calling things competency that aren't competency, right? They're just like, oh, it's the sexy word of the day. We're going to throw a label on it and call it competency, and then we're sort of done. But it is an area in which there's been a lot of agreement at the federal level, when there's not a lot of agreement at the federal level about a lot of things, particularly between the different branches of government and the different parties. President Obama has made some high-profile speeches in which he's talked about competency-based education, named a few of the sort of leading-edge institutions, called them out presidential level. He has directed the Department of Education to play with its federal financial aid rules to allow for some experimentation to basically stop paying for the credit hour, which is the real problem in higher education, I think, from a policy standpoint, is federal financial aid is tied to the credit hour. And so the Department of Education has basically used two either never before used or rarely used authorities to allow institutions to pay for learning rather than time. One is called direct assessment, and one is experimental sites, and we can talk more about those if people have questions, but I won't go in totally into the weeds on those because it gets really weedy really quickly. But what else in terms of the House?
Say again? Oh, sorry. I think we're just not close enough.
Oh, I'm
sorry.
Is this better? Oh, sorry about that. So, first time I've ever not been loud. So you have this happening at the presidential, the executive level. You also have Congress, the House of Representatives, which doesn't agree on anything other than maybe naming post offices. Passed a bill unanimously in last session to encourage basically calling for more sort of innovation labs and experiments with competency-based education. The Senate has introduced a companion bill, but it hasn't been voted on yet. So that's interesting, that's exciting. There's a lot happening with federal financial aid that I think the feds are doing this responsibly. They're not right now. I think they're not sort of saying, hey, let's throw out the credit hour totally because we know how to replace it and we know how to measure learning and how to pay for it. No, what they're saying is, we need to grapple with these questions. We need to know what it would mean to pay for learning. We need to know what it would mean, to try to, if students move along quickly, do you pay them as they accelerate more quickly? What about for students who are slower? What do you do about students who still need to pay their rent, but they're slower in moving their competencies? There's all these tricky financial aid questions that I think the federal government is trying to grapple with as they wonder, whether or not anybody's getting a bang for their buck on those $150 billion a year. So there's also interest at the state level, and this may not be surprising and might be obnoxious just because I used to work in the federal government, so that worries me. So where I'm, and I think a lot of the interest is, again, in the sufficiency argument and trying to contain costs. And again, I always go to the worst case scenarios, just how my brain works. It's not a fun place to be in my head, but I don't know how many folks are familiar with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and so they basically come up with model legislation and they shop it around to states, and then states, state legislators will pick it up and adopt it, and they have this model legislation that this was their one piece for higher education in their upcoming term, and I'm just going to read it. So the Affordable Baccalaureate Degree Act would require all public four-year universities to offer bachelor's degrees costing no more than $10,000 total for 4 years of tuition fees and books. The act would require that 10% of all public four-year degrees reach this price point within 4 years of passage of this act. To achieve this price point, universities would be instructed to capitalize on the opportunities and efficiencies provided by 1, web-based technology, and 2, competency-based programs. And as somebody who's really been pushing for competency-based education, this gives me chills. This makes me really concerned. I want to say, no, 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 I don't want to do competency-based education. Forget it. I'd rather have time. So I think that, you know, there's a lot of reasons. Like, people are looking for a magic bullet. But I think ultimately, I think there's a way to do this and have it really be transformational, but it's going to require everybody in this room and folks in the academy really grappling with it honestly and saying, no, 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 this is actually what a quality degree means, and here's how we can do it in a CBE way and not in a CBE way. So, you know, I think there's a lot of movement, and the reason I'm not too freaked out, even though I'm a little bit freaked out that policymakers will go this way, is I think there are a lot of folks on the ground who are working and making programs, and programs that reflect the diversity of America's higher education system. I mean, when we started on this, we had a meeting at Lumina like 2 years ago now, or is it like right before Cracking the Credit Hour came out, or right after the Cracking the Credit Hour came out, and we basically were trying to find all these institutions who were doing competency-based degree programs, and there were about 20 who we found, and now there's over 200. And there's just more and more interest, and again, folks who are really grappling with it and getting their faculties together and designing the competencies and all of that. So I'm excited, but also worried.
Yeah, excited but worried. I want to go back to you, Dwayne, and bring together two things that we've been hearing. So when you launched the DQP, as I think, it was not trying to crack the credit hour. It was not trying to get at the efficiency problem. It was trying to get at the transparency and the quality problem. But since you started this project, obviously the efficiency discussion, as it intersects with competency credits, has accelerated. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you now see the DQP as a tool in this conversation. We certainly hope the quality part doesn't end, but how do we use it in the conversation that Amy has just described?
I think it gets back to this idea of what does a degree represent, and then if we're actually oriented around degrees, quality degrees, and we have an understanding of what that means in terms of the learning that the student receives, what are the implications of that for how programs are designed? I think that's the issue. I think that's the issue with the credit hour, is that in an environment where you really are focused on the degree, what are the building blocks that lead you to the degree? That's interesting. And when you look at how people are thinking about that, it seems that it's breaking down in two sort of levels of granularity. On the one hand, you've got these little micro competencies, the Khan Academy things, where you get these little skills that you need, and you pick them up as you need them, and you can pick them up very quickly once you know you need them. It's real hard to teach somebody something that they don't think they need, but once they need it, it's real easy to teach them. So, students, you see this all the time. When they need a math concept, they can get it. When they don't need a math concept, it's really hard to teach it to them. So there's those little micro kind of competencies. And then there's this other set of sort of bundled competencies. They're skills, really, higher level skills, but they're modules is kind of the way I think of them, that you can use in a variety of different ways. You might be able to use it here, you might be able to use it there. They may be occupational, and so on. When you look at a competency-based education program and say a obvious skills sort of area like, say, nursing, you see it built up of these sort of practice-based competencies. So, but the fact is you can do that in history, and you can do it in literature, and you can do it in music, and you can do it in a lot of different, you do it everywhere. Ironically, the course is what gets lost in that. It's sort of like, oh my gosh, so what's the course for? Because you kind of it goes that way and it goes the other way, but we're organized around this. And that's increasingly irrelevant to what we're trying to build. So one dimension of it, I think, that the only way we're going to figure that out is by working with people in classrooms. The second thing about all of this is that all of this ties to this question of when you look at the statements in this document, or LEAP, or any of these other pieces of work that are going on about what it is we actually want students, when you start talking about what a degree actually means, they are at a level where you have to think about how do students really develop that proficiency. So if the competencies are the building blocks, and that's kind of where we came down, and the proficiency is pulling it all together, that integration is so key to all of this. Well, when you think about designing programs around that, it takes you in a very different direction in terms of what programs look like, how they're delivered, how they're structured, and frankly, how students come into it. Now, this is a long roundabout way to get back to your question. So let me just throw a case out there. You're probably all familiar with these accelerated degree programs. They're really, really interesting. They're all over the place. A lot of them are at the associate degree level. They're very interesting. They take students, there's one in Indianapolis that we've done some work with. The SUNY system does work in this area. There's one we've worked with in Missouri, the Missouri Innovation Campus. Very interesting programs, but there's a lot of these. They're around. You take students in high school who are at risk of dropping out of high school, and instead of fixing them so that they can graduate from high school, you just basically take high school out of the equation and say, let's put them in a program to get them an associate degree. It's crazy. Totally counterintuitive. You block schedule them, cohort-based, so they derive support from each other. You repackage all of the aid and the costs so that it basically becomes a stipend. You greatly compress the time so that they finish an associate degree about the time that they should be dropping out of high school. The success rate is, and by the way, you tie it to a good job, you tie it, and you target it to first generation, low income, precisely the kind of students that are the most difficult for us to reach today. You look at these programs, and they get graduation rates, completion rates on the order of 75, 80%. We look at the students in the program at Ivy Tech in Indianapolis, and we say, wait a minute, who's the disadvantaged students? It's the regular students. Their success rate is much lower than the students in this program. Now, what does that have to do with efficiency? It's got everything to do with efficiency. If you look at it, again, from the point of view of the student, which is how all of this is driving. These students are finishing faster, and they're getting better learning as a result, and more of them are finishing, and the unit cost of delivering those graduates goes down dramatically as a result of all of that. That's the way to think about this. But the only way you derive those kind of benefits, the real benefits, not the fake benefits, Amy, that you were pointing towards, but the real benefits, I think we're becoming convinced, is through the redesign of educational programs around these new approaches. And when you do that, you can capture all kinds of benefits, including efficiency benefits. But most importantly, they just work so much better for the students. So I think it's a deeper conversation than just, hey, if we give credit for some stuff that somebody's already learned, can we save some money by doing that? Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Very much worth doing. Let's not forget that while none of this may be all that applicable to 18-year-olds going through college, we all know that huge numbers of students are not 18-year-olds going through college, and there's a whole lot we could do to make their pathway much more efficient. And so we need to do that. But it's really this deeper, I think, question of instructional design where you really get at it.
So I'm going to come back to some implications of what you talked about regarding what I said at the beginning about the bar being raised in terms of what employers want. Because the bar is, as I read the economic situation, not only is there an efficiency problem, But there's a disconnect between the need to do this faster and quicker and, frankly, the portfolio of what we want students to learn and the level they want to learn, which is bigger and higher. Now, which doesn't mean that there's not wasted time in our educational systems. There probably are. But there is, in my mind, a bit of a disconnect between our doing it a lot faster and quicker, but we're actually being asked to do more, and students are coming in less well prepared. It's sort of hard to figure out how that calculus is going to work. I want to come back to, and pretty much anybody can respond to this, maybe we'll start with Amy. There's a fantastic article in the current issue of Change magazine, and I think actually Peg just left, so somebody tell her that I said this, because it really is. It's an incredible article by Chris Gallagher about the whole competency-based education issue. And I want to quote from it and ask you all to comment. So it's an article of worry, basically, about where we're headed with this movement. And he expresses it this way. He says he has a worry, quote, that the current CBE movement forgets what should be regarded as the central enterprise of higher education, ongoing, engaged teaching and learning. And he goes on to suggest that, quote, few of today's CBE programs include significant peer interaction or sustained interactions between teachers and students. We know that learning is not just picking up discrete bits of content wherever and whenever one might encounter them. It is a social process of co-constructing knowledge and practice with other people. So there's a lot packed into that, but is that a legitimate concern about the directions we're headed in either individual CBE movement programs or in the larger conversation about throwing out the credit hour in the interest of efficiency?
So I think there's a few responses, and I would put the responses on the sort of the.
Go really close.
Okay, sorry. I would put those responses on the sort of continuum of where we are now, and where higher education is now, to where we want it to be. So for the first piece. Agreed that it's not ideal for folks to get atomized pieces of knowledge, right? That it's supposed to be deeper learning. Higher education should be more than the sum of its parts. But right now, I think we're getting a lot of atomized. I don't even know if how much atomized learning we're getting, and how much atomized, we're taking this course and this course and this course. In some ways, is it better if we're going to just be doing a menu? Is it better to get a menu of competencies or a menu of classes? So again, not saying that that's the ideal, but just in terms of where we are, I think it's important to start and sort of say, let's start from the reality of where we are, not where we think we are or where we'd like to be. The second piece is then, and I hear that and I think that's right, but for the moment, for adult students, let's say you have, we have an adult student who is in a job and has hit a ceiling because she doesn't have a degree. The employer thinks she has the skills. The employer is okay with, what she is, but unfortunately they have this process where you need a degree to get to the next level. So if she just needs to take 3 additional competencies to get a degree that will move her along, are we really going to say, we're not going to give you access to that because we really want this holistic, deeper learning? Agreed that we all should get, but until and unless we're all getting that sort of seems unfair, and it seems like it's penalizing those students who most need the degrees right now. So so that's sort of the less than ideal and sort of defensive response to it. But I think the real response is, I'm surprised that he says that most CBE programs don't do that, because I think it's a fundamental mischaracterization of what most CBE programs are doing. So again, this idea of applied knowledge, I have some random quotes that I knew would come in useful for this session. So one is from somebody who clearly isn't respected by anybody in the field, John Dewey, who says, give the pupils something to do, not something to learn, and the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking. Learning naturally results. So I think part of the whole point of competency is this applied knowledge, it's self-directed knowledge, it's doing something that is meaningful to the student. And yes, it is co-constructed with peers, it is co-constructed with faculty mentors. I think about, I think it was in one of the sessions yesterday that WGU had Gallup do a poll of their of their students, of their graduates, right? And this is WGU competency-based model, fully online, right? And their students felt much more engaged and felt like they had a relationship with people in the college than most traditional colleges. So that relationship is critical and very important, and many of these programs have peer-to-peer learning. They have social networks. They have, there are these transformational relationships. And I have this letter, and I'm sorry for, there were some people who were in a session yesterday, and I read from this, but I'm going to read from it again because I think it is so powerful. So this is a letter from one of College for America's graduates. And this is somebody from their associate degree program. And there are these tight relationships with employers. And the employers are like Slim Jim Factory, Dunkin' Donuts.
You should say what College for America is.
Oh,
just
I'm
to
sorry.
make sure that people know.
College for America is it's a spinoff of Southern New Hampshire University. It's an associate's degree program. Well, now they have bachelor's degree programs. It's a fully competency-based program that's spun out of their innovation lab. They're doing amazing work. There's so many amazing people in this space. And so this is from a woman who basically said, look, I needed a degree in order to get a bump. You know, I was hitting a ceiling because I didn't have a college degree. And she wanted something that was cost effective so she could spend money, you know, save money for college education for her sons. What I didn't know was that my CFA journey would be about so much more than getting my degree. I got an honest-to-goodness liberal arts education. While in the program, I learned so many things. I learned about the lean principles, the Federal Reserve, globalization, the moral philosophies of Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill. I learned about the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, while exploring art from masters such as Donatello, Rembrandt, Manet, Picasso. I studied how the earth cycles water, carbon, nitrogen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I strengthened my listening skills, practiced giving and receiving feedback, improved my ability to resolve conflict while working on teams. And working on teams, by the way, so interesting that he's like, oh, it's this co-creating knowledge. The teamwork is a really important part of College for America's model, and it's the part that students struggle with the most and that they find most frustrating, but it's some of the most transformational. And so all of these responsibilities in my new job require a broad set of skills, et cetera, et cetera. With CFA's self-directed learning model, I've learned to be curious, to be my own best teacher, a good recipe for figuring out how to recognize and solve problems. That, to me, is the promise of competency-based education, and it is not what Chris Gallagher is saying. So.
Okay. So I want to go to you, Elena. Go ahead. You want to just comment?
Sure,
I have
sure.
a question.
For one, I would agree with Amy that there's a semantic problem with competency-based education and who's calling it what. That's a much longer conversation about what is and what isn't competency-based education. But the central concern about what students are learning, trying to make it a richer experience, trying to make it better learning, and then in relationship to the credit hour, how you capture that, how you track that, how you account for that, is, at least from the perspective of the analysis that we've done, this is a system issue, right? So what does that mean at scale? Because what you described, Amy, can happen in a lot of places, competency-based or not, and does. There's plenty of poor quality examples, but there's just as many high quality examples. What does it mean at scale for a system this large? And so again, you know, my comments began with looking back 100 and some years when we're grappling with the same issue. We've got this system that's expanding like we couldn't believe in its population, its diversity of the population, and so forth. We have to be able to not only provide better learning, but we also need to, as a system, be able to provide a way of communicating that learning so that the student, at the student level, the student needs to understand for him or herself, what am I learning? What am I supposed to learn? What am I learning? What have I learned? And right now, the records that we have, the transcripts that we have, they don't do that, right? I mean, you have, Intro to Psychology, it's listed as PS 103, and there's a number next to it. Nobody knows what that means. That is an academic, that is only for academics. That just serves academics. You don't know what it means. And for that matter, not even academics, because it won't even translate in many cases to a graduate program or out to another institution well. Right? No, absolutely. I think that's right. So it doesn't do enough. It's not to suggest that the transcripts and the records the way we have them now is enough. There's a lot that we found in our own research that's out there, and you all are probably doing much of it, where people are being really creative around how do you do that? How can we show on a record? Stanford, for example, and Helen Chen was here earlier. She had to step out, but she works at Stanford closely with the registrar there, Tom Black. I mean, they're trying to develop what they're calling a scholarship record. It is essentially a way of showing describing what a student has learned, like what they're supposed to learn, what they've learned, in a transcript format. The concerns with that, of course, are the same. How do you translate that? Or rather, I should say, how do you transfer that? Will employers accept that? Will graduate institutions accept that? And does that disadvantage students who are at the largest institutions, tier 2, tier 3 institutions, where there's not a lot of time in the admissions offices to sit down and really go through and read what a student has learned? Like, let me really think about Dante for a minute and read this beautiful story, because the big institutions don't have time and the money to do that, and so they don't. And the students that are at those institutions, therefore, could very much be disadvantaged by that. That's not to suggest it's not a good idea. It's just a challenge. I think that's a challenge also for a lot of the portfolio work that we're seeing that the field is grappling with, but needs to, sure.
So I have other questions, but I actually want to open it up to the audience. We put on the table a lot of stuff, both the question of quality and efficiency and competency in a lot of different ways, and the question of the future of the credit hour, and we haven't solved that problem. But let's open it up to questions. If you can speak loudly, and I'll try to repeat the question so the people in the back can hear. Yes?
I have a question about degrees.
And introduce you to us just so we can get to know each other.
Mm-hmm. Those companies say we would like to have students that are globally engaged. So my question is about the degree engagement, and a lot of those companies have massive portfolios in Europe. Mm-hmm. So Europe might be the closest. Europe, of course, has gone through very much reform with the Bologna Accords and so forth. So my question is whether you could speak to the level of the degree, articulation of how should we be thinking about our degree versus those other degrees around the world.
Did people hear that in the back? Raise your hand if you did not. Okay, we're good. Go.
Okay. How do we think about our degrees in relationship to what's happening in the world? Two dimensions I'll just mention. One is they're both stated in your question. One is, of course, in the development of these various approaches, we have looked a lot at international models, not just in Europe, but in other countries as well. There's some very interesting things happening in Latin America, for example, that are not as well understood, but are in many ways even more profound. Our engagement with the Europeans, in particular. One of our European colleagues that we're working with said, well, you're coming over here and asking what we're doing, and we want you to take it back and do stuff with it, and then come back and share with us what you've done so that we can improve that. Take it back and prove it so that we can borrow those ideas and actually transfer these ideas back and forth. I actually think there's a lot of potential there to do that more systematically, to create a more international, more global approach to solving these problems. Because one of the things we found when we look into all of the data on what's driving this increasing demand for skills and knowledge and the ability to apply them, which is what's at the root behind all of this, certainly what's behind our goal, is that these are global phenomena. We tend to think of it as sort of local conditions driving it, but in fact this is happening all over the world. And the responses to this, how we respond to it, when so many people in so many different countries are dealing with the same set of issues, why don't we learn from each other? One more thing that I think we could do better is to treat different countries as almost sort of natural experiments where you can learn, try different things and see how they're doing it. People that didn't necessarily start with the same set of assumptions may be able to try something that might prove to be very, very promising. The other part of your question has to do with global competence for students. What does that mean? What do they need in this increasingly global environment? As you stated, I think we need to take that much more seriously. Frankly, in the U.S., we've thought a lot about international education, of course, but international education means two things. It means a junior year abroad for American students, and-
tiny little,
a tiny
little
fraction.
itty-bitty number of them.
Yeah, it's not really required. It's a nice thing to do if you're economically well off and you have the means. You can do that. But it's just a nice thing. Or, of course, international students coming to the U.S., which is an enormous part of our the way we finance our education system, frankly. We need to think beyond that. We need to think much more deeply about that. You talk to students all the time. I talk to them much less often. But I can say when I do talk to students, I have a sense that many, many American college students today believe that their careers and their life will involve living abroad, will involve working for companies or for not just companies. It's not just about business. This is about the not-for-profit sector. It's about the NGO sector. More and more of that work has an international dimension and component as well. And frankly, we should be worried by the fact that Latin American countries like Chile and Colombia and countries in Southeast Asia and even countries like New Zealand and Australia are responding to this same set of conditions by looking to Bologna systems as being more transparent, a better way to communicate what their degrees mean, what their graduates can do, than looking, as they have always done, to the U.S. model as the sort of gold standard of what degrees ought to represent. So I think there's something very important there that we tend to give a lot of lip service to, but I don't think we take it as seriously as we should.
I'll just add one other perspective on this. Dwayne is right that there's just an enormous amount of interest in addressing the question, how do we re-engineer higher education to give students what they need, defining it, re-engineering it. I was recently, shockingly to me, asked to come speak about liberal education and our research on it, the employer research, in Russia. And I learned a lot there. They have these little tiny experiments in liberal learning there. But one of the things that I learned is, of course, that the system is not set up for it at all, and there's quite a bit of skepticism about that in there. But I, of course, was trying to make the argument for our vision of liberal learning, which has to do not only with learning a lot of subjects, Dante and Renaissance, whatever, but integration. And I realized as I was talking and being translated and probably not conveying too much, that they were still trying to grapple with the idea of whether it was a good idea in college to study more than one thing. I mean, at all. So the breadth part of general education or education was still something they were trying to get their heads around. So my going on to the integration part was a little hard to get to, but they also are grappling with exactly the same question. So other questions, comments? Yeah, and can you say who you are?
Yep, I'm Kathy Kaczorowski from Rasmussen College, and we are excited about the opportunities that are out there in the changing systems and really serving our students better, who are career-seeking students who frankly aren't interested in transformation, but we want to transform them anyway.
Right.
Right. And I think my question really may not be answerable in a panel like this, but I just want to say that we are working really hard, and I'm really stuck on this sense of how can we make changes to our system, both internal to our college and external to our country and beyond, that are transformational to the system, that disrupt the system, but in a way that doesn't hurt the students. But yet, right. The other side of that spectrum is, how do we avoid making changes so small that they don't disrupt things and don't really help the students? So kind of what's that balance of innovation and disruption that also protects the student experience and the outcomes that we want them to achieve?
People hear that in the back? Who wants to tackle that one? That's an excellent question.
I'm going to doubly put my Carnegie Foundation hat on. So the foundation right now, much of its core work is around training the field of education in improvement science and in networked improvement communities. And what that means practically for your question is that the best way to learn what works and what doesn't is to do it through rapid tests of change. And the rapid is important there. A 90-day iteration, that's arbitrary, but it's borrowed from healthcare. The point is it's short. So you're not going to have a year pilot, because then that year's gone. And so then, and the argument, of course, well, students lost a whole year, and it's true, right? If there's something you can test that's discrete enough, and a lot of these models and design, the pieces, the elements of them are like that. You can test them. I just spoke with someone about they're working with the FAFSA, not necessarily related to this, but the question, they're talking about the questions on it. Well, that is a discrete tool, right, that you actually can test with people, and you can do it quick. And you can do it with faculty at various places. This is the networked part. If you get faculty, for example, in all of the departments or in a bunch of institutions in a system to do the same thing and to use a common metric and to do rapid tests of change, you will have answers and you will have learning that happens much quicker and I think will be much more useful and much less disruptive to the student, but allowing then for these innovative ideas to flourish. That's somewhat up here, but there's a tremendous amount of resources that the Foundation has on this, so if folks are interested in the methodologies, I can, of course, share more, and the Foundation's website has all of this as well.
Can I just, so this is not a meta answer, this is just, so I think there's a few different things in competency-based education. One is, there may be different modes of delivery, right? And there's the self-paced, and there's the online, there's this, there's some that's, just, it still is time-bound within a course, and still people are sitting in seats. So I think we have to separate that piece out from the ultimate goal of learning, and I don't see how students are not well served if you're very, very clear what the expectations are and what the outcomes are, and you've pegged them to, what the world needs. And I think the DQP is incredibly powerful for that. So, so it's both sort of the standards and then the assessments. I think if you get that piece right, and you can really prove and ensure that there is learning, students are going to be better off. But yes, then there's all the, okay, how do we make sure that we're not just experimenting with this mode that undermines that piece?
So I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, Greg.
Greg Cook, University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. In all the talk about learning, one way to think about learning is gain. And so I'm wondering in the competency-based DQP and so on, if there's some conversation about instead of just setting standards and bars and competencies that every student would need to meet to get a degree, we think about students engaging with the degree program, and if they can show gain, even if they don't hit the same bar as other students, do we give them a degree to reflect their gain? So it's just trying to recognize individual differences in preparedness and gain. Because learning is gain, not learning isn't necessarily hitting a bar. It's the same bar for every student.
But in some ways, I think you're using the degree as like the ultimate thing that will matter. Whereas if you sort of break it up into multiple credentials, then you can give people credit for learning that's actually been achieved. But if they don't hit the mastery, I mean, to me, that's the whole point of competency-based education, is you can say with certainty, somebody with a degree from here knows and can do this thing. I mean, so WGU, for example, was founded by a bunch of governors, 19 governors. There were two in particular. One was really obsessed with this sort of online education, the promise of online in 1995 to bring education to like the sparsely populated, spread out populated state. And the other was really interested in competency because he was a pilot and had a flight instruction school. And in his mind, you don't get a 90%, in order to be a pilot, you can't pass everything except the landing and be a pilot, right? Like, you're confident or you're not. And so I think there are ways to sort of say, here's what you are competent in, and maybe it means getting sort of beyond the degree.
Dwayne, do you want to say anything about that? This balance between mastery versus recognizing growth and learning. Or I see Peter out there shaking his head. Do you want to comment, Peter? One of the authors of the DQP is in the audience. Go ahead, stand up, Peter.
I mean, the DQP is fundamentally about achievement.
Right.
It's standards. The growth part of it, you have to grow in order to get to the standard. But good effort doesn't count.
Right.
Yeah.
As a faculty member, it's impossible. We will not graduate any students who can do everything on that matrix. So do they not earn a degree then if they can't do calculus?
Well,
It's pie in the sky. It's great, but from faculty's perspective, it's
Wayne, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for one thing, calculus is not in here. So, and I mean that quite sincerely. This is about, I mean, look at the statements. And the question is, in your, wait. In your program, not my program, in your program, what does it mean for students to demonstrate these kinds of skills? You define it. I don't define it. Politicians don't define it. You define it. What does it mean for a student to be able to demonstrate these kinds of skills? If we believe collectively that these are the kinds of skills that a college degree ought to represent, it is, of course, a very difficult question, but it is, in fact, the right question, which is how do we help all of the different students that we're serving to learn this? Do I expect a magic wand and miracles to happen? No. Does anybody expect that? Maybe some do. But that is the task. That is the focus. How does this actually happen? What do you do when it doesn't? You redesign, you rethink, you reconsider. Now, that is something that is very difficult, frankly, and it gets back, I think, to your question as well. These things cannot be done in isolation. You can't do it yourself. There are barriers that you are running up against that also have to be addressed. Your question about, how do you not use the students as a guinea pig in this is sort of the flip side of this other concern. I mentioned these accelerated programs that get tremendous student outcomes by sort of redesigning the ways in which aid and the curriculum and so forth is packaged. Those programs are, in fact, against the law under federal policy. You have to have a waiver on Title IX or Title IV, to be able to do that, because you cannot provide aid that way. So there is a lot of work that has to be done to clear out the brush, clear out the barriers, so that genuine innovation can take place. Right now, we've got a lot of interest in experimentation, and all of it is done on waivers because, in fact, none of it is actually permitted. And a lot of it is sort of not just federal aid regulations, but a lot of the ways we think about stuff, the way states fund higher education, and the way we think about providing services to students and how we treat them. But is it about actually learning? Is it about actually getting students to that level? Unfortunately, yes. And fortunately, yes.
Well, that's a good place to end. It's quite clear, I think, that we have just scratched the surface of all the issues that you've put on the table, including the ones that were just put on the table. So it's clear we're going to have lots more sessions digging into this in future meetings at AAC&U. But join me in thanking our panel.